In the fall of 2019, a 70-year-old widow in Knox County, Maine, started dragging rotting seaweed from the beach in a wheelbarrow, the piles that tourists complained about and the town paid to remove. She went after every storm. When the nor'easters blew through and the ocean threw its weight against the shore, the tide line filled with racked dark tangles of kelp and rockweed and sea lettuce. Torn from the bottom and deposited on the sand in heaps that steamed in the cold air and smelled like the thing the ocean becomes when it stops being pretty. The tourists called the town. The town sent a crew. Margaret Hale got there first. She backed her husband's truck to the beach access, loaded the wheelbarrow, and scooped the rack with a garden fork. Load after load. Seaweed into the barrow, barrow into the truck bed, truck down the coast road to 3 acres of vegetable garden and berry patches on soil so thin you could hear the granite underneath. She spread the seaweed across the garden beds the way you spread a blanket over something you are trying to keep warm. 4 inches thick, dark brown, wet, glistening, smelling of salt and iodine and the deep water life of things that grow without soil or sun. Tom Crowley, who kept a garden on the next lot and spent $300 a year on commercial fertilizer, slowed his truck one afternoon and watched her spread a forkful of rockweed across her tomato beds. "She's covering her garden with rotting seaweed," he told his wife that evening. "The whole road smells like low tide at noon." Margaret did not explain. When her daughter called from Portland and asked what she was doing, Margaret said she was following a book. She did not say whose book. She did not say how she had found it or what she had found inside it. Nobody understood why she was dragging rotting seaweed from the beach the following May. When frost took every garden on the road except hers, the ocean answered. If stories of widows who carry the ocean to their garden, frost that cannot reach what seaweed covers, and the kind of stubbornness that smells like low tide but grows like spring, means something to you, subscribe and stay with us. Tell us where you're watching from. We read everyone. Margaret Hale married Bill in 1976, and they built their life on the line where the ocean meets the land. Bill fished. Margaret grew. He left before dawn in a lobster boat and came home smelling like bait and salt water. She spent the days in 3 acres of garden on a ridge above Penobscot Bay, growing vegetables in soil that fought her every season, thin, acidic, rocky, draped over granite the way a worn blanket drapes over a body that is all bones. Knox County soil is not generous. 3 to 6 inches of topsoil sits on ledge that was old before anything grew on it. The pH runs between 5 and 5.5, too acidic for most vegetables. Too acidic for the calcium and phosphorus in the soil to become available to roots. Every spring, the frost heaves push new stones to the surface, like the earth is trying to return what it never wanted. Margaret raked rocks every April the way other women swept porches, because if she didn't, the garden would become a quarry. She bought lime every year to raise the pH. She bought fertilizer to replace what the thin soil could not hold. $300 in a good year, more in a bad one. The results were always the same: adequate. Not poor, not abundant, just adequate, the way food grows when the soil is doing its best with very little to work with. Bill died on a November evening in 2017, a nor'easter. The boat swamped 3 miles out. The Coast Guard found the hull the next morning, overturned, drifting south of Vinalhaven. They did not find Bill. The ocean kept him the way the ocean keeps everything it takes, completely, without apology, without returning what it has claimed. Margaret did not sell the house. Her daughter in Portland asked her to. Friends asked her to. The minister asked gently whether a woman of her age should be living alone on 3 acres of granite soil with winter coming. "This is where the ocean brought him every evening," she said. "I'm not leaving." She farmed alone the following spring, and the spring after that. The soil did not improve. The frost did not relent. The rocks kept coming. She spent her $300 on lime and fertilizer and harvested what the land allowed, which was less each year because she was 69 and then 70, and the wheelbarrow felt heavier each spring, and the garden gave back exactly what thin soil on granite gives back: enough to continue. Never enough to feel ahead. Then she found the book. She found it at an estate sale in Rockland on a Saturday in September, $1. The cover was stiff with salt air, and the pages smelled like a house that had been closed through too many winters. A book about Irish seaweed farming, the kind of book that sits on a shelf for decades because nobody in coastal Maine thinks of seaweed as anything other than the thing that washes up and smells. She almost put it back. Then she opened the front cover and stopped breathing. A bookmark, a lobster trap tag, flat plastic, faded orange, the kind that hangs from every pot Bill had ever set. On it, in waterproof marker and handwriting she had looked at on grocery lists and Christmas cards, and the logbook he kept on the kitchen counter for 40 years. Bill Hale. Lick. 4271. Bill had bought this book. Bill had read this book. Bill had marked his place with a trap tag the way he marked everything with whatever was in his pocket, which was always something from the boat. She did not know when he had bought it, she did not know why, but the tag was on page 47, and page 47 described what Irish farmers had known for 1,000 years. Seaweed feeds land. For 1,000 years, coastal farmers in Ireland had collected storm wrack, the kelp and rockweed and sea lettuce that the Atlantic threw onto the shore after every gale and carried it to their fields. They spread it on soil that was thin and acidic and rocky, soil like Maine, soil like Margaret's. The seaweed decomposed quickly, no lignin, no woody fiber to slow it down, and released 60 trace minerals directly into the ground. Iron, zinc, manganese, calcium, magnesium, the entire periodic table dissolved in ocean water, concentrated in plant tissue, delivered free of charge to any beach that faced the wind. The book described the Irish population boom of the 1100s, attributed partly to the widespread use of seaweed fertilizer on coastal farms that had previously grown little. It described the Scottish Outer Hebrides, where farmers built entire garden beds from alternating layers of seaweed and sand. It described the Channel Islands' tradition of vrake, the communal harvest of storm wrack. Protected by law, treated as a right, but the part that changed Margaret's understanding was a passage about mulching. Seaweed laid 4 inches thick across a garden bed acts as insulation. It holds the heat the soil absorbs during the day and releases it slowly through the night. On a frost night, the soil beneath seaweed mulch can stay 6 degrees warmer than exposed soil. 6 degrees is the difference between 28 and 34, between a dead seedling and a live one. Margaret looked at the trap tag. Bill had been reading about the things she needed most: soil nutrition and frost protection, in a book about the ocean he worked on every day. He had known. He had bought the book. He had marked the page. He just didn't get the chance. She closed the book and drove home. She looked at the beach below the ridge where the last nor'easter had deposited a windrow of rockweed 30 feet long and 2 feet deep. The town crew was scheduled for Monday. She got the wheelbarrow from the barn and went down on Sunday. The first beds burned because she treated the seaweed like mulch instead of medicine. She spread the rockweed directly from the wheelbarrow, wet, salt-crusted, still smelling of the tide that had delivered it 12 hours earlier, 4 inches thick across the lettuce beds on the south side of the garden. Exactly as the book described, it looked right. It smelled like the ocean had moved inland, which was not entirely wrong. Within a week, the lettuce edges turned brown, not frost brown, not disease brown, chemical brown, the sharp, crisp browning of leaf tissue that has been exposed to more sodium than it can process. Salt. The seaweed had come straight from the ocean without passing through the rain that would have rinsed it, and the salt concentration in the mulch was high enough to pull moisture from the leaves beneath it through osmosis. She had laid a blanket of salt on a bed of lettuce and wondered why it died. Crowley leaned on the fence the following Saturday. Salt water kills plants, Margaret. Everyone knows that. That's why nothing grows on the beach. She went back to the book, page 52. A paragraph she had read too quickly the first time. Allow rainfall to rinse the rack before applying, or spread 2 weeks before planting to permit natural desalination. The salt was temporary. The minerals were permanent. She needed to let the rain do its work or give the seaweed time to breathe. She spread the next load 2 weeks before planting. November, rain steady. Cold, persistent, washed the salt from the rack and into the ground below root depth. The seaweed darkened, softened, began to decompose. By the time she planted in spring, the mulch smelled less like the ocean and more like a forest floor. The second mistake was the extract. She filled a barrel with seaweed and water, sealed the lid tight, and left it 4 weeks, twice as long as the book recommended. The result was not the amber liquid the book described. It was black, reeking of sulfur, the unmistakable smell of anaerobic decomposition. She sprayed it on the tomato leaves anyway, because she had waited a month and did not want it. By evening, the leaves were spotted with brown burns where the acidic solution had eaten through the tissue. She poured the barrel out behind the barn and started over. 2 weeks. Lid loose, stirred every other day. The second batch turned amber. The smell was strong but tolerable, briny, vegetal, the smell of the ocean decomposing into something useful rather than something angry. She sprayed it at 6 in the morning, when the dew was still on the leaves, and the tomatoes absorbed it without complaint. By April, the beds that had been mulched with rinsed seaweed looked different from every other bed on the road. The soil was darker, not the pale gray-brown of Maine granite soil, but something approaching black, the color of soil that is being fed. Worms had appeared, not many, but worms in soil where worms had been rare because the acidity drove them away. The seaweed had raised the pH, the worms had followed. Margaret knelt beside the tomato bed and pushed her fingers into the soil. It crumbled. Maine granite soil does not crumble. It breaks in chunks or it stays rigid. This soil crumpled the way soil crumbles when something has been added that changes its structure at the level where roots live. She wrote in Bill's logbook that evening, the book where he had recorded every haul, every pot, every day on the water for 40 years, below his last entry, November 14, 2017. The day before the nor'easter, she wrote in handwriting that looked nothing like his. Soil darker. Worms came up. Bill's book was right. The neighbors were watching. She's still spreading seaweed. The whole road smells like a bait shop. $300 of real fertilizer, and she's using beach garbage. Bill would have known better. He was an ocean man, not a garden man. The frost came on May 22nd, which is late even for Knox County, where late is the only kind of frost that matters because it is the kind nobody prepares for. The forecast said 34 degrees. It hit 28. A still, clear night, the kind that lets the heat drain from the soil the way water drains from a tipped bucket steadily, completely, with nothing between the ground and the stars to slow it down. By 3 in the morning, ice had formed on the puddles in the driveway. By 5, the grass was white. Tom Crowley's garden took it full, his tomatoes transplanted the first week of May. The standard date, the date everyone uses because most years it is safe, went black overnight. The stems softened at the base. The leaves turned dark and wet and hung like flags on a still day. His peppers were gone. His basil collapsed into something that smelled sweet and wrong. $300 of commercial fertilizer in the soil beneath them, perfectly applied. Completely useless against a temperature that does not care what you have spent. 2 other gardens on the road lost everything above ground. The conversation at the hardware store the following morning was the same conversation. Knox County has every time May frost hits. Why do we bother? The season's too short. You can't trust the weather this close to the water. Margaret's garden sat under 4 inches of seaweed mulch. The mulch had been decomposing since November. 6 months of slow biological work, rockweed and kelp breaking down into a blanket that was part insulation, part nutrition, and part something the book had described, but Margaret had not fully believed until she saw it: thermal mass. The seaweed held the heat the soil had absorbed during the day and released it upward through the night, the way a stone wall releases the sun's warmth hours after sunset. The soil beneath the mulch stayed at 34 degrees while the air dropped to 28.6 degrees, the difference between a live tomato and a dead one. Her seedlings had frost damage on the outermost leaves, a light brown crisping at the tips, the kind of damage a plant recovers from in a week. But the stems were firm, the growing tips were green. The basil was standing. The peppers had curled their leaves inward but held. By July, the difference was no longer about frost. It was about everything. Margaret's tomatoes were darker green than any tomato plant on the road. The deep, saturated color of a plant that is not missing anything. The seaweed had released 60 trace minerals into soil that had been surviving on the 3 or 4 that commercial fertilizer provides. Iron turned the leaves dark. Zinc strengthened the cell walls. Manganese activated the enzymes that turn sunlight into sugar. The ocean had provided what the granite never could. Her kale was larger than Crowley's, which should not have been possible on thinner soil with no commercial fertilizer. Her basil was thick and fragrant in a way that made the farmer's market customers stop walking and lean toward the table. Everything she grew that summer had the quality of things that have been fed completely, instead of partially, the difference between a meal and a supplement. One evening in late July, Crowley stood at the fence between their lots. He looked at his garden, adequate, pale, the familiar mediocrity of $300 applied to granite. Then he looked at Margaret's dark green, dense, growing in soil that smelled faintly of the ocean on a coast road where the ocean was already close enough to hear. He stood there until the light changed. The next morning, he walked over. He came through the gate that had not latched properly since the winter Bill died, because Bill was the one who fixed latches and Margaret was the one who learned to live with things that didn't close all the way. Margaret was at the far end of the garden, spraying the amber extract from a pump sprayer she held with both hands, the same motion she made every other Tuesday morning, misting the leaves with a solution that smelled like the ocean reduced to its most useful form. Crowley walked the length of the beds without speaking. He stopped at the tomatoes first, touched a leaf. Dark green, thick, the texture of a leaf that has everything it needs and is not spending energy looking for more. He walked to the kale, leaves the size of his hand, curled at the edges so dark they were nearly blue. He walked past the basil and the smell stopped him, dense, sweet. The kind of fragrance that commercial basil never produces because commercial fertilizer does not contain the trace minerals that make fragrance possible. He knelt beside the tomato bed. He reached under the seaweed mulch and pushed his fingers into the soil. It was dark, soft, crumbly in a way that Knox County granite soil has no right to be. A worm turned away from his finger and disappeared into a channel that should not exist in soil. This thin, he pulled his hand out and looked at the dirt on his fingers, black, moist, alive. He looked at his own garden across the fence, gray-brown soil, pale plants, $300 of commercial fertilizer doing exactly what it had done for 20 years. Which was enough and never more. He stood up and looked at Margaret. "What did you put on this garden?" Margaret set down the sprayer. "What the ocean left on the beach." Crowley looked at the beds. Seaweed mulch, half decomposed, brown and dark, spread across every row. The same rack he had watched the town crew remove from the beach for 40 years. The same kelp and rockweed he had driven past 1,000 times without slowing down. The same material the tourists called garbage, and the town budgeted $12,000 a year to haul to the transfer station. He looked toward the ocean. It was visible from Margaret's garden, a strip of gray-blue beyond the spruce trees. The same water that had taken Bill and delivered the seaweed, and would keep doing both for as long as the coast existed. He was quiet for a long time. "How much does the beach have right now?" Margaret looked toward the water. A nor'easter had blown through 3 days ago. The tide line would be thick with fresh rack kelp torn from the bottom, rockweed stripped from the ledges, sea lettuce in bright green tangles, free, delivered, waiting for someone to see it as something other than a mess, more than either of us can carry. The following week, after the next nor'easter, Crowley's truck was at the beach access before the town crew arrived. He did not bring a wheelbarrow. He brought a pitchfork and a flatbed trailer and the quiet determination of a man who has spent $300 a year on something that works adequately and has just seen what free looks like. Margaret was already there. They worked the tide line together without saying much, forking the rack into the trailer, the way people work who have both been doing physical labor long enough to know that conversation slows the fork. Crowley filled his side. Margaret filled hers. The town crew arrived an hour later and found less to remove than the budget had planned for. Nobody complained. By November, Crowley had spread seaweed across half his beds rinsed by rain. 2 weeks before the ground froze, exactly the way Margaret had shown him, he did not call it a technique. He did not call it Irish. He called it what it was. "I put the beach on the garden." His wife said the road smelled like low tide. He said the road always smelled like low tide. They lived in Maine. Margaret's daughter drove up from Portland on a Saturday in October. She walked the garden the way daughters walk their mother's gardens when they are looking for signs that the woman they love is still the woman they remember. The tomato beds were spent, but the kale was still producing. The soil was dark in a way the daughter had never seen, dark and soft and alive with worms that had no business being in Knox County granite soil. "Mom, this garden is the best I've ever seen it." Margaret was standing at the edge of the bed where the seaweed mulch was thickest. She looked at her daughter. "Your father found the book." Her daughter looked at her. "Dad?" Margaret reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the bookmark she had carried since September, a faded orange lobster trap tag with Bill Hale written in waterproof marker, in the handwriting of a man who had spent his life on the water and had understood, before anyone else on this road, that the ocean and the garden were not separate things. He bought it. He knew, he just didn't get the chance. The ocean had been delivering fertilizer to the beach every storm for as long as the coast had existed. 60 minerals free of charge, carried by waves that do not send invoices. For 1,000 years Irish farmers had known this. For 40 years Bill Hale had fished the same ocean that fed his wife's soil. And somewhere in those years he had bought a book and marked the page and run out of time before the knowledge made it from the truck to the garden. She was the first one in 50 years to carry it home. What is the ocean or the river or the rain leaving near you that nobody thinks to collect? Tell us in the comments. Tell us where you are watching from. Subscribe, and we will see you next week.